What's going on, guys? Rob Reese here. This video that you're about to watch is an interview that I gave with a Christian police officer and kind of the surrounding questions regarding how police treat civilians, how his particular department handles law enforcement engagements, what his thoughts are on God's law and how the law should be applied, and a number of other subjects. So I hope this is edifying to you. We may not agree on everything, but I do hope that you watch this with an open mind and come out of it blessed. Thank you. Hey, what's going on, guys? Rob Reese here. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode, and hopefully this is going to be a episode of encouragement as well as openness, and just kind of getting to talk about some really difficult issues. Today we're going to be speaking with a police officer. His name and origin of living is going to remain anonymous, and you also are going to hear that his voice is distorted. Now, for understanding purposes, I believe that he has a great perspective to give insight on the role of police, what he encounters in law enforcement in his role, and the actual place that he is currently in. I believe also shows kind of the truth of the matter of what it looks like for an officer who is in an area that is considered a high crime and certainly a heavy population of African American and Black people. So I'm hoping that today we're going to be able to talk about some really hard topics, topics that will make you think, but most importantly will make you think biblically about it. Just for transparency purposes, I am neither a person who sits on the fence of Black Lives Matter. I think that organization is wicked at its core, although the statement itself is accurate. I do not believe that one should adopt that even statement simply because it has a tie directly to the movement that is thoroughly unchristian. At the same time, I am not 100% pro-police. Let them kind of do their thing and get away with certain things, because I believe fully what happened with George Floyd recently, and we've seen multiple circumstances of overuse of force by police. I think what those officers did was get themselves involved with murdering a man, even though he was not a individual of a high moral standing. I don't believe that plays any part in what actually happened. And I believe that each one of those officers should, in fact, receive the death penalty. So I'm going to probably make a lot of you upset simply because I am neither fully on one side or the other. But that's okay. That's okay. And I think these discussions are going to be serious and helpful moving forward. And I'm a guy that doesn't shy away from controversy. So I figured, why not do it myself? I am putting myself fully out there. You know who I am. But this particular brother, I wanted to make sure that he is remaining anonymous, as well as because most departments in the United States have policies regarding putting themselves on social media, which is another thing that I disagree with. But it is what it is, and I wanted to honor this person to make sure that they do not break any protocol to, put at jeopardy their family. So, Officer X is how I'm going to to call you from now on. So, Why don't you give us a little bit of a background, first and foremost, about your Christian faith? Did you come to faith before or after becoming a police officer? Give us maybe a little bit of your testimony.
Sure. When I was converted when I was a teenager, I'll just leave it at that. So obviously I was not a police officer, as I was too young. But so I was in high school at the time, and I was going to a church. I was heavily involved in a youth group in a denomination that is not explicitly reformed in nature, let alone really biblical in a lot of other ways. Um, and I was involved in a lot of secret sin, and I was your typical nominal American evangelifish Christian, so-called. And actually, my mom was converted right before I was. She came across a brother that many people have probably heard of, Paul Washer, and she introduced me to a sermon of his on YouTube, The Shocking Youth Message. I'm sure lots of you are familiar with it.
Yeah, we all are. We repented a second time when we heard that one.
Yeah, I hear that also. So the Lord used that sermon to convict me, to expose to me my own hypocrisy, um, and that's when I first actually started to read the scriptures for the first time myself, and the Lord converted me at around the age of 17. And so, to give some perspective, I've been a police officer for, we'll just say, less than 5 years, but close to 5 years.
Perfect. Now, with that said, are you amongst mostly unbelieving officers?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Do you feel that you are among mostly unbelieving officers?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Overwhelming majority.
Okay, perfect. Now, when it comes to your relationship with your officers, obviously you have to develop a certain relationship with your police officers. It's definitely not like becoming a teller at a supermarket or at the local retail shop. This is a very different job than most, and certainly most people will agree that this is probably one of the hardest jobs, physically, emotionally, really kind of the entire being of your person. It takes a big toll on. So, with that said, do you find yourself to be uh, maintaining close relationships with your fellow officers? And if you do have close relationships with many of the officers, do you think that you've developed closer relationships with them rather than people outside of the profession?
So, no, most of my close friends, in fact, I would say really all of my very, very close friends that I actually spend time with in person are not police officers. I spend most of my time with people from my local church and even some other friends and Christians who don't necessarily go to our church. Um, but I do maintain a fairly sound relationship with lots of the other officers. But I don't talk to them, most of them, outside of work.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. Uh, Really quick, by chance, uh, does does your um, does your department, if you can say without giving away information, uh, do any of your officers really in your department patrol uh, a a Planned Parenthood nearby?
No, we don't have one where we work in our city, in our jurisdiction. In fact, the closest one to us, not necessarily a Planned Parenthood, but an abortion clinic, is a little less than 2 hours away.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so I'll go ahead and just skip some of these questions now. These set of questions, Officer X, I want to ask you strictly from the perspective of a Christian, the theology behind law and civil government and civil magistrates. This is probably where most police officers and myself would diverge in terms of agreement. Not that we are going to disagree with much, but certainly certain aspects of how to be a Christian and a law enforcement officer, especially with the understanding on how the American law system works, as well as the laws that are currently on the books. What are some policing techniques, besides getting angry or even potentially cursing at a suspect or an individual, that you see unbelieving cops practice that you yourself would never be able to do?
I thought about this particular question beforehand, and um, I had difficulty thinking of something specifically. I think once we get more into, um, I guess, the sort of policing that I see specifically in my community, in my department, we might be able to hit on some of those things. But just broadly, in a general way, I don't know if I could really answer that.
Okay, so now when we see certain behaviors caught on camera, um, obviously we are all familiar with what recently happened. Um, have you ever seen an officer that you have worked with do something that was just clearly wrong? And I'm not simply speaking about what is against protocols per se, but even if it is protocol, do you see some things that your particular department allows for that would clearly go against maybe what Christians would be able to do?
Sure. So, in some contexts, um, we're allowed to lie about things. And I'm not, this is another conversation that we could have, but I think this we would actually agree that in some cases lying is permissible. But lying has been, in my perspective, done in ways that is sinful, is unhelpful, and manipulative. And of course, I have seen officers treat people as though they have no value. They disrespect them. They don't treat them as they should with the inherent value that they have.
Okay, fair enough. Now, I think this is where a particular point of the conversation might be beneficial, because I see only one instance in God's law, in a general equity sense, to where quote unquote lying would be permissible. And I don't think at that juncture it would be considered lying. I think it would be considered righteous deceit, and it's only in the context of saving a life and protecting from an evil doer. When it comes to policing, you're trying to find an evildoer. How do you actually justify, say, and maybe this is not even a perfect example, but maybe think in your mind of an example of where you're initiating an interaction with a citizen, and maybe you have some type of idea that, a feeling, if you will, the spidey senses have gone off in your mind about being uncomfortable or something, but that leads to you maybe saying, hey, the reason I stopped you was because I saw a cracked windshield, when maybe you didn't, but you initiated it in order to kind of develop a little bit more information and find more information. How can you justify that kind of a scenario just because you feel funny?
Yeah, so that would be grossly immoral and outside of policy. You cannot synthetically construct probable cause and then make it up out of thin air. There has to be an actual violation to initiate that contact. Now, if I were stopping somebody that I knew had a felony warrant,
Okay.
but maybe they weren't aware of it, and I pull them over, I might give them a reason, a fake reason for why I pulled them over to keep them at ease so that they don't act out violently or escalate the situation more than it needed to.
So how did
That's
you?
sort of the instance I have in mind.
How did you even come to the part of where you were able to find out whether or not they had a felony warrant? Because in my mind, and of course, this may come into policies that are enacted that I think just in general are unjust, and maybe give me your thoughts on it. But it sounds like you're running somebody's plate before there's a reason to actually run the plate. Now, that doesn't remove the fact that you probably have the authority to do that, or maybe even your vehicle does that automatically. I've actually done a little bit of homework on this. But how do you actually justify that as being something that is morally acceptable? Because that just seems to me that you're invading people's privacy, and now you've just kind of hit the jackpot, and you found something that this almost seems like Minority Report.
Okay, so yeah, maybe I should have clarified. I was thinking more of an instance where I actually see somebody in the driver's seat that I recognize personally. So the thing about the community I work in is it is a large community, fairly large, but it's small enough that the offenders we have are repeat offenders generally. So I've been working the streets long enough that I'm familiar with a lot of the individuals and families that typically are out doing criminal things. And so I was thinking in the context of I see somebody that I actually know. I'm not just running a plate arbitrarily and then I submit their information. Oh, they have a warrant and pull them over. So that would be a different
So
situation.
Let me ask this. So maybe you've gotten a briefing from the morning or something, and they were like, okay, this is a person that we know is out on felony warrant, and we need to bring him in. Something like that.
Yeah, it might be something like that. We have we have emails and we communicate with each other about high priority warrants that we're looking for. Our detectives let us know who they're looking for, things like that.
Okay, so the knowledge of that person having a felony warrant and pulling them over, is that not enough? Because that, I mean, if you guys know for a fact that that person has a felony warrant out and you're trying to pick them up, that seems to me like it would be legal, right?
whether
Oh yes, I didn't mean to cause any confusion. That is the reason for the stop. Is if you recognize them and you know they have
okay,
a warrant.
So the matter is lying to the person in order to do what at that point? Because that was what this entire
Right.
situation question was brought forth by, was because the idea that a police officer, you believe that that particular situation would call for lying. Uh, could you maybe elaborate on why you believe that would be okay?
Certainly. So I'll just give an instance. I'll try to make it as general as I can. I once pulled over someone in this exact context that I'm speaking of with you, and I tell the person, "Hey," and this is someone that I've talked to numerous times. "Hey, you have a felony warrant." She's stopped in her car, and I tell her that she needs to step out of the car. She refuses. She goes into reverse. She nearly hits me and my patrol unit. And I almost could have gotten severely hurt. Now, if I could have gone back in time, I may not have told her immediately, "You have a felony warrant." I could say something else. I mean, she's going to ask why the stop is being initiated. And I could have made up a reason and avoided any harm or escalation of a situation where it's not necessary.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. The people who are listening, make of that what you will. With that said, I think we have a pretty good idea of where you stand on that, and certainly I believe that there can be nuance in this situation, and so I want to talk about the same subject, but whether or not, let's say, you uh, would see a fellow officer engage in something like an example like I gave you before. Now, have you ever caught a fellow officer doing something that is blatantly wrong, and what would you then do about that particular situation?
I have not personally come across something um, that was blatantly wrong that I would need to interject or intervene on the situation. But I would. I absolutely would. I care more about righteousness than, you know, so-called loyalty to a coworker. I care more that righteousness and justice be done than some sort of commitment to that.
Okay, now with that in mind, let's say you were out with a partner. I don't even know if you roll with a partner, but let's just for anonymity's sake, just talk about hypotheticals at the moment. Um, if you actually were rolling with another police officer, you saw another police officer engaged in something that was clearly wrong, maybe excessive use of force, maybe they are doing something that is clearly immoral according to your Christian faith, um, and and you were there to kind of see everything unfold from front to back. Would you ever forcibly use your abilities and your physicality to stop a situation?
Yes.
So let's go one step further. We all saw what happened to George Floyd. If you were one of the officers there, would you have pulled your weapon out on him or tackled any of the officers to make them stop what they're doing?
Yeah, so if I could have been there to see that he was placing his knee on George's neck and that they were allowing him to asphyxiate, laying in that position for that long of a period of time, I would have, I would have intervened. I don't know if I would have pulled out my gun immediately. I don't know if it would have required that, but forcibly pulling him off of him. But someone does. You don't need to keep someone on their stomach in handcuffs for that long. It doesn't matter what the situation is.
Amen. Now, this brings up a topic of kind of dispute. Okay, it's the concept of excited delirium. Now, there are no consensus studies regarding this concept of excited delirium. Uh, I'm assuming you, as a police officer, have been briefed on this theory. Maybe could you give us a little bit of education, the audience listening, as to what that is, in a quick synopsis, and whether or not that comes into play, especially because this is still a debated theory within the arena of scientific thought.
Certainly, I've taken some courses dealing with de-escalation, specifically speaking to so-called excited delirium. I'll be honest, I don't think that there's a scientific basis for it. I think that it's a diagnosis based on certain symptoms that one is displaying, and I just don't really see the basis for it. I think it's sort of a broad brush. I'm not going to necessarily say that it's a cover-up, but I am a little bit confused about why why that language or that diagnosis is necessary. I have seen and dealt with people that exhibited those signs, profuse sweating, excessive strength and aggression, and a lot of that, in my cases, we do have people who suffer from mental illness, and that can be another aspect of it. But I don't think that we really have a foundational basis to say that this is legit.
Okay, fair enough. Now, when it comes to the different types of things that police involve themselves with, whether that be in getting involved in interactions with criminals, and when I say criminals, I'm talking about dangerous guys who've been in jail, they're engaged in maybe in criminal activity, they're maybe in a gang and they're known for violence and things like that. Beside that, right, because I have a particular bone to pick with police officers when it comes to this, but how much of your day is spent protecting people from actual danger versus doing things that have been shown to be clearly revenue generating, like a simple speeding ticket or like a tail light is out, and maybe give me your thoughts on those types of things that police are involved in, because from my perspective and many others, it would just seem like those are really things that should be concentrated on from a police perspective, because I mean, let's face it, if I'm going 5 or 10 miles over the speed limit, or I just did a rolling stop at a stop sign, these are very, very small things, but it seems the numbers show that this is the majority of what police end up doing versus actually protecting and serving.
Yeah, let me give a disclaimer before I answer the question. This is very, very timely, honestly, in God's providence that we would be having this conversation at this particular time, because personally I'm going through a bit of a reconstructive phase in my perspective of police work. I'm questioning things. I'm assessing what am I accomplishing, what am I prioritizing with time spent. Now, as far as so anyway, I'm going through a bit of a transition here.
Fair enough.
And there's some things that I am not completely landed on, and I'm not going to pretend like I know everything. But I will say that on a personal level, previously, actually, for my entire career, I've never been much of a ticket guy. I don't really care to pull over people who are driving on their way to work for going 5 miles over the speed limit to write them a ticket. I really have no interest in that. So most of my time was spent toward spending time in high crime areas and stopping suspicious activity, suspicious drivers for violating even petty traffic violations, we'll call them that, and trying to do investigative work in those traffic stops, questioning them about their criminal history. I have access in a local database to things that they have been arrested for, incidents they've been involved in, and I question them about what they're doing, where they're going, and typically I've been looking for narcotics. That's been something that I've really prioritized, at least up until about 6 months ago. That was something that really interested me. But as far as the time spent toward preventing actual crime, and yeah, I'm specifying actual crime here now to make a contrast to what I was just speaking to. We respond to calls and we help citizens when we have calls for service. And those are pretty frequent. Generally we have about 50 to 75 calls for service every 12 hours.
Wow. Okay, now that brings me to another question that I think is relevant to what you just spoke about. The difference between victim and victimless crime. What are your thoughts on policing for drug possession?
This is probably the high point of my transitional progress, the progress of my transition as of late is specifically dealing with drugs. So when we look at Scripture, which is our ultimate authority, the infallible, inspired, inerrant, sufficient Word of God, I don't see a basis for um, drugs, narcotics, witchcraft, possession of said substances being illegal or something that you would proactively look for to see if people are in possession of those. So I'm questioning why. I'm also questioning the. I'm glad that my voice is distorted. I'm also questioning the government's intent on the war on drugs. Who's really benefiting from all of our proactivity and what we really are accomplishing by filling up our prison systems with these non-violent, victimless crimes.
Yeah, one of the things that I've recently come to really have a strong conviction on is my position on this, because I think that in God's word, that every time that we see a penalty that is given by the state or the magistrate, it is always because somebody else was affected. Maybe you can make the leap of somebody engaging in violent behavior due to the drug, but it is not the direct relation to it. And one of the things that really shocked me is these data points that I learned about regarding when the war on drugs started, and the fact that certain drugs actually affect certain communities more in such a way that it actually ends up disproportional regarding who it actually affects, and the fact that they end up in jail. So the black community is overwhelmingly affected by crack cocaine, and it actually has a very little violence factor to the way they end up behaving in the community. But dust cocaine or powder cocaine ends up having a much higher violent connection to that drug, and it affects the white community. And of course, there's a higher fine attributed to crack cocaine, and it affects the black community much more. And then powder cocaine ends up being a much lighter sentence, and of course, this ends up making it look like there's a disparity in there. Now, I'm gonna full out say that this is where a lot of my brothers and sisters will disagree with me, but I don't think we could utilize that today as an indicator of systemic racism. And that's where I want to really head onto now, brother, because really that's the conversation that I want to get into today, is the idea of systemic racism, especially how it deals with police and citizens alike, because we can all see the numbers that while there's only 13% of black people in America and 60+% equal the population of white people in the United States, yet the incarceration rate is much higher in an actual number of the black community. Now, no one can dispute those numbers. Everybody agrees on that number. But the question is, are police actually targeting black communities, black people? And then, of course, does that mean there is systemic racism? Now, I'm going to go ahead and share my thoughts at the end of this program, but that's kind of the meat of what I want to get into right now. As a police officer, do you think that in your department specifically, or in general, just in your opinion, are there racial biases when dealing with black suspects that end up leading to excessive force versus white suspects?
For my department, I would have to give a hearty no. That does not exist in our department. And I would say for the overwhelming majority of what I see, even outside of my community, I would also say no. I would say that mostly the narrative of systemic oppression has been a construct of manipulative people in their ivory towers.
Okay, fair enough. Now, um, with that said, what is the atmosphere like in the community of officers during this time? Obviously, we've seen the chaos that has erupted. I personally myself have even been in the midst of a riot ensuing in Dallas, downtown Dallas, and certainly the tensions were, I don't want to even say high. It was a clear delineation. It was us versus them, um, and the police came out in full force, even though there were only a small number of people that started to do the things that ended up making the eruption actually occur in greater numbers. So within kind of the community of police, especially in your area and your department, um, what's the community feeling like of officers, and is there a division that you're seeing amongst cops?
So our department is very unified. Um, we do have some black officers also, and we are all unified. Specifically speaking to the George Floyd situation, I've not run into one person that does not think that what he did was evil and despicable and ought to be abhorred. But we haven't experienced any rioting like Dallas or um, obviously Minneapolis or Seattle or places like that have. So overall, in our community, we have a lot of support actually for the police department, and I think that's actually due to um, how we conduct ourselves.
Could you maybe speak to that a little bit more?
Sure. So we we do live in a fairly conservative uh, place. I'll give that as
Yep.
well. Um, so that plays a role, but also we are not every department. You really can't compare departments next to one another. They can be very different um, from from the chief on down. I mean, uh, it can be a stark contrast. But I think that the majority, if not all, of those employed at our department are our chief, our assistant chiefs, all the brass, all the administration, all our patrolmen. Um, we conduct ourselves with a level of professionalism, with a level of respect for people. We are not heavy-handed with people. We're patient, and we have to use force when we're put in a situation to use it. But we don't have a problem with that sort of discipline or abuse of power.
All right, fair enough. And I know a lot of this. Those of you who are listening, remember this is department specific, right? Um, and maybe this is a great place to put this in here, Officer X, because what I noticed, I've done a lot of research this last week, and I found a study that was able to give a number of scenarios. Okay, and it was 11 different scenarios. All of them were scenarios of wrongdoing, but it escalated. The number one thing was like, getting a free cigar from somebody that was a normal citizen while in in uniform, and then the most severe circumstance was use of force unnecessarily. And what they did was they said, okay, we're going to do a kind of a poll here on would you report this person, and how severe do you consider the bad thing? And they, of course, broke that down even further to kind of break up the two different types of people. And they put these two different types of people, and it was a nationwide survey of police officers, anonymous. They didn't give any details, but they gave a good mix to kind of give it a good idea of this is what we're dealing with on an average basis. And they broke it up into what they called Agency 2 and Agency 23. Agency 2 was the epitome of a great precinct, police agency, very little corruption recognized within the department, so on and so forth. And then Agency 23 was the kind of description of they are known for more reports of abuse. They've been under the gun a couple of times for doing things incorrectly and just plain out wrong. And they called them Agency 23. And this is what the study said. It said the most systematic and dramatic difference between Agency 2 and 23 is evident in their attitudes toward what we call the Code of Silence. And it's the Code of Silence is really the understanding of this is the unwritten rule that you don't tell on your fellow officers when they've done something wrong. It says further in the study, it said in both agencies, few officers said that they or their police colleagues would report any of the least serious types of corrupt behavior. And these were the initial ones that were really inconsequential, but they're clearly wrong. That like getting free gifts, or while in uniform, you're making business connections for your on-the-side business while on a call. And then it continues on to say, officers from Agency 2 reported that they and their colleagues would report the behavior described in the 7 other cases, the more severe ones. But in Agency 23, the one that's kind of known for that behavior, however, there was no case, none, that they would that indicated the majority would report. In sum, while the code is under control in Agency 2, the good police department, it remains a powerful influence in Agency 23, providing an environment in which corrupt behavior can flourish. So this was a real study done of real police officers stating there is real corruption that occurs. Meanwhile, it is still a much smaller percentage of the number of police officers at large. However, there is this very real idea that, you know what, because you're in blue, I'm not going to tell on you. What do you think about that?
This is such a foreign concept to me because, again, I can only speak to my context, but everything that we do at my department is vetted. I wouldn't even have to be put in a position to have to report it because we have very high standards for what is and is not recorded. Speaking of the more serious and severe abuses of power. So any situation, especially thinking of use of force situations, those are always reviewed by supervisors, and nothing goes, undealt with. So I've never had to be in a position where I would have to even be forced to consider compromising.
Okay.
Um,
Now, why do you think this is actually the case? Because now I'm not dealing with anecdotes. I'm dealing with this study that I just read to you. Why do you think officers would not intervene in even some of the slightest of issues? I mean, what do you think that could be? Because I'm sure maybe you even have these conversations, at least from a theoretical sense, with your fellow officers.
yeah, so I think that it could be several things. It could be cowardice. It could be fear of man, what man thinks of you. You want your coworkers to think you're a cool guy or whatever. You want to be part of this buddy buddy system. Um, but allegedly, two of the four officers that were there when George Floyd died were rookies. You may have seen that.
Yes, I did.
And I would like to add a little bit of nuance to that situation. I'm not saying that they shouldn't receive justice, but being a newbie, a rook, watching a 15 plus year veteran officer doing something, I remember being in field training. Honestly, things were moving at such a high pace at times that I may not have even been able to discern that my superior or senior officer was doing something wrong because I was still trying to filter through so much of what I was learning. It was almost like learning a new language doing this job. I didn't know my left hand from my right hand because I'm trying to multitask and consider so many different factors at one time. So I would like to perhaps at least have us consider that maybe people who are inexperienced may not even realize or see the error that is taking place in some situations. Again, I'm not making a final judgment in that context, but just something to consider.
Sure. Now, I think a lot of us, especially from our perspective, one of the things that we definitely don't like. I'm not a big fan of it because we actually, as Christians, we end up saying you can't use that as an argument for a particular situation, like because it kind of sounds like, well, you don't know what we go through, therefore you can't accurately explain the circumstance or discern the circumstance, right? That's kind of what it sounds like sometimes from police officers when they're so pro blue. And I'm not talking about necessarily another Christian, just in general. Um, but it seems like it's the same argument that we end up having with a woman who is pro-abortion, right? You don't know what it's like being a woman, therefore you can't say. Um, is that an accurate, from your perspective, analogy to say it's not necessarily fair for an officer to say, well, you don't know what we go through, therefore keep your mouth shut? Because to me, it's the same argument. Because from my perspective, when I saw that video, and literally everybody else around the world, in great majority, said, that's just stupid. I don't care who you are. That never, I mean, it's not even like a, well, maybe, sorta. And I saw a couple of people trying to utilize that argument. I mean, that was a like no-brainer. It was as if you walked up with a gun, shot somebody in the head, had the thing on camera, and was like, let's see if more evidence comes in. Why is what we saw not enough from the perspective of potentially a police officer? I know maybe you don't have that perspective regarding the George Floyd case, but like, why would anybody say anything other than that was pure evil? I don't care if you're a rookie or not. I mean, the guys, I mean, why is it that he can say, I can't breathe, and you can't just check for a moment? Say like, okay, let me get off his neck and roll him over for a sec.
Yeah, so I'll try to answer all the different questions.
Yeah.
There's a lot to cover.
Sorry,
Sorry. It's hard to keep up with everything. So first of all, yes, I would say that the analogy you used is accurate. It's a logical fallacy. If anybody tries to use that argument, shut it down. I will give a disclaimer though. There are people who don't know case law, who don't really know law at all, who aren't tactically aware or studied, and they may try to make a judgment on something that they see in a 15-second clip, and in actuality, they don't know what they're talking about. But I would not say that's the same argument that you presented at the first. That would be misleading and false,
Fair enough.
and easily proven that way. So I think that unfortunately, history has sort of created this hesitancy, even from Christians, to immediately jump to judgment on whether or not something was wrong in a video. And I'll be honest, the first time I saw the George Floyd video, I was nothing but just grieved, depressed, and I didn't know what to do with myself. But there have been previous videos that I'd seen, say Alton Sterling back in 2016. There are many, many others that, that they showed you, the media showed you a 15 or 30-second clip of these encounters with police officers, and they fueled it with this narrative with assumed intent and assumed actions on the part of the police officer that were actually shown to be completely false. And so um, it's almost as though they just wanted you to believe immediately that the officer was in the wrong, and when it came to the court of law, they were actually shown to be justified. So I think that the reason that even some people are hesitant is because they've been lied to before. But eventually, at some point, like you said, there's got to be there's enough evidence to look at something, because these videos were plenty long, and they showed you all that you needed to know about what was happening to George Floyd. It wasn't a 30-second clip with no context. We actually had a lot of context in this particular instance.
Perfect. Now,
I'm going to transition, and this is kind of going to tail off towards the latter part and the end of our discussion. And I just want to say thank you for being willing to at least answer these questions, Officer X. I really do thank you so much. But with that said, let me ask you just plain flat out, do you think that police officers get favorable treatment in general simply because they are police officers?
Yes, I do, and I do think that we do. I think that we receive favor when we shouldn't, and we're scrutinized at times when we shouldn't be. I think both can kind of exist. Both do exist somehow. It's a confusing word.
I totally get the scrutinization part, because I agree with you that people watch a 15-second clip of something and they come to a conclusion when there is a whole slew of behaviors that actually happened before the interaction became a thing. And the reason I ask is because this is again where I can't stand the fact that police officers are able to get away with so many things that they do, because we look at situations like what happened in Dallas a couple of years back with a gentleman named Timba. I don't know if you're familiar with the case, but the circumstance in which this young man, mentally ill, died in the custody of police was the same. He went into essentially to not cardiac arrest, but asphyxiation. The cops ended up covering it up. 3 years goes by. The video, the cop cam, the dash cam, and the chest cam were never released to the mom. The report that was put into the system was falsified, they found out. And then Once they were able to uncover it 3 years later, the police get off, and they are now the tape is for everyone to see. Here's the thing that is interesting is that it was a white young man with white police officers that this unjust behavior and that is clearly seen and caught on camera, and they ended up getting off scot-free, still working at the police department as we speak. Why do you think they are getting off so easily?
Because men are sinful.
That's the easy answer. Come on, Officer X. I'm talking about in the.
I know. I'm just
earthly
joking.
plane.
No, I get what you mean, and I am familiar with the situation now. I did see that recently. It's not being as widely broadcasted because it doesn't fit the narrative. Clearly, his life didn't matter the same way that George's did. But both of them matter. And to be honest, I have no earthly idea why those men are still employed with that police department, let alone, indicted on some criminal charges or at least investigated further for criminal charges, rather. I think that they should be. I think they should be, but as to why exactly, I don't know. Oh man, you're gonna have to edit that out.
I will bleep that out.
Yeah, sorry. That wouldn't happen where I live currently. I think that criminal charges would be filed, and honestly, I've never seen somebody falsify a report like that. Don't have any experience with that. Again, thank God. I just think that I work for a mostly upstanding police department.
Amen. Okay, so, all right. We could talk about all these kinds of cases, but they happen more often than they should, right? And all sorts of things happen more often than they should. And one of the things that really frustrates me is because I can see the injustice in all of these types of scenarios, and specifically in much of the what is labeled racist scenarios. And I can evaluate them with a objective eye, because I want to look at the numbers. I want to be able to evaluate the statistics. And right now, what is at play the most, and it's what's gonna really get me in trouble with a lot of my friends here, is the media does an incredible job of manipulating the masses. And I'm not talking about conspiracy theory. I am talking about clear-cut facts. One of the things that you will not see on TV is how many people of white skin color be mowed down by people. I just mentioned Timba. This is a 5-year-old case that, unless you're digging it up now, you probably never heard of this person. There is that other gentleman who was a bug guy, an exterminator, and he had a BB gun where he would use to shoot rodents. White guy got caught in a hotel, and some lady called and said, "This guy's got a gun." These cops got called into the hotel, and they're giving him all sorts of really confusing directives. Raise your hands. Don't put your hands anywhere. Get on your knees. Get on your stomach. If you fall on your stomach, don't put your hands on the floor. And it was a tense video. And the kid goes to pick up his pants because they're falling off. This kid is nervous. They're screaming at him. They've got guns in his face, and they mow him down. Brutally. White cops, white victim. Nothing ever happens to the cops. I mean, these circumstances happen over and over again, but they're never really broadcasted. I absolutely believe police brutality exists. I do believe that police get away with things, but like you said, like Officer X said, it's due to sin. There's another study, and you're going to appreciate this, Officer X. There was another study that came out that said, by the same reputable place that put out the other research regarding the Code of Silence. This is from the National Institute of Justice. They said that the finding that an officer's race is unrelated to the propensity to use force, so that the idea of racism, epidemic level racism, especially in the realm of policing, is not true. What is true is they were able to find that white poor people and black poor people both suffered the same consequences with one another. It has everything to do with family. It has everything to do with who you hang around. It has everything to do with education. It has everything to do with whether or not you've been arrested multiple times. But the media will not show you that. They will give you stats. They'll reference a lot of these studies, but they'll leave out the most important aspects, and it's just disingenuous, and it's really duping a lot of brothers and sisters in the faith into believing that cops are out to get you. Now, with that said, brother, okay, I know that we went really long, but what are your thoughts on how we can ease the tensions between law enforcement and citizens in such a high, tense, emotional time? Because, I mean, what we're seeing unfold before us is absolute insanity. Not just black people, but just people in general, because this is permeating now into all communities.
Absolutely. So I hope this doesn't come across as the Sunday school answer because it's gospel truth.
Amen.
There is always going to be ethnic tension until the day of our Lord's return. So I'm not saying I'm gonna answer your question, but I want us to make sure that we're all being biblical here and we're assuming the right expectations for what the future has for us. There's always going to be ethnic tensions, but what we can do is we can't change what's happening outside of the cities that we live in, but we can have positive encounters where we love our neighbors, we love our police officers in our specific community. Now that can be done in multiple different ways, but if you get stopped by a police officer, or if you encounter people even on the opposite end, if you run into people in a public place that maybe look as though they are living in a criminal lifestyle, what you need to be doing is loving your neighbor. But ultimately, the solution to a racist heart is the gospel of Jesus Christ and regeneration. But I do think that there can be a positive consequence as far as in the culture, concerning the culture, when we just love our neighbor. We're kind to our neighbors. We are peaceable with police officers, peaceable with our community. But ultimately, it's difficult for just one person to actualize this and with such a vast number of people. We can only expect so much from ourselves. So all we can do is control our individual encounters with people.
All right, praise God. Now, how can we help in communicating with our family members, our kids, especially those of age to where they're a little bit more mature, not always necessarily with a driver's license, but up to that age, and of course older. How can we communicate to them better what we ought to be doing if we're pulled over or stopped by an officer on the street? What are some things that are helpful to maybe ease the tension in there? Because especially for my black brothers and sisters or people of color who end up feeling nervous around police officers, what are things that they can do to help the situation?
Sure. So, I will first say that um, most people, I don't think, have been stopped by police officers. But if you are stopped by a cop for the first time, most if you're concerned, if you're worried, those will probably be dispelled as soon as you start talking to the person. Because at least in my experience, a lot of cops I work with are just super friendly, and they're not coming out guns blazing just because they're pulling you over for an out, tail light or something. So don't. Honestly, I would encourage people to not necessarily buy into this narrative of having to always be anxious and fearing for your life just because you get stopped by a police officer. I think that it's fear mongering, and it's unrealistic statistically that you would encounter, like you said, that the pest control exterminator guy. That situation is it's too common that it's more common than it should be, but it's not likely that you will encounter that. But just a few words of advice for people that maybe want to do something proactively to help it. Of course, just be respectful. I mean, these are all, what I'm about to say is all going to be stuff that is already organically being taught in the home by your parents to your children. If you're instructing your children and the fear and admonition of the Lord to, respect, at least to a degree, the authorities that God has put above you, then they'll already naturally be in a position to have a positive encounter with a police officer. But just be respectful. Um, I mean, they're just going to ask you the same basic information. They're going to ask you for your driver's license, for your insurance. They're going to check that stuff, and they're probably going to write you a warning or maybe sometimes even a ticket and send you on your way. They're probably not going to have a long, drawn out conversation with you. But the fear mongering thing is concerning to me.
Now, one of the things that I know that people lack understanding on is what a police officer is legally able to do versus your rights as a citizen of the United States. And sometimes uh, there is there are laws that are in a sense unconstitutional, but there are authority that has been given by the police officer in order to ask certain things, and uh, and sometimes there's a confusion as to what is able to be done by the officer versus what your right is. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah.
so let's say in the instance I get pulled over, and I'm a firearm owner. I let the officer know in Texas that you're supposed to let him know that you are carrying, and they will, of course, you'll have to provide your license. And what is a police officer able to ask me in that particular scenario, but I have a right to deny?
So, um, well, let me answer your question with the opposite of what you asked first. You have to provide your name, your birthday, and your address.
Okay.
If you've been stopped for a violation, all three of those things are things you have to provide, including the address. Some people don't understand that, and I'm just speaking of Texas here. I'm not speaking of every state. Um, as far as questions they can't ask you, I mean, I'm trying to think of one that someone would maybe try to ask you that they shouldn't. I mean, honestly, I'm blanking on what someone would try to ask you.
I mean,
They
But
can legally, a police officer can ask you to get out your vehicle. They can ask you to search your car. They can
Certainly.
ask you where you are going, but
Mhm.
all of those things pending they have reasonable suspicion of a crime that is either been committed or about to be committed by you. You can assert your right and say, I deny those things, and there should be no problem, correct?
Correct. You can, of course, you can deny a search of your vehicle if they don't have probable cause to search your car. But like you said, if they ask you to get out, you do have to comply with that.
Why?
Well, not necessarily saying that I would employ this, but this is just what the law says: is that there are certain you can control the movements of a person for officer safety reasons. Now, if an officer is asking you to get out of the car just because he feels like asking you, he's going to have to answer for that and articulate why. Like you mentioned, reasonable suspicion earlier. In our reports, when we're building our reports, we call them building blocks of reasonable suspicion, leading up to eventually probable cause that a crime is existing. Reasonable suspicion has to be articulable. You can't just say, oh, well, he looked shady or she looked shady, so I asked if I could search their car. It doesn't work that way. You can't do that, and it's going to get thrown out, and you can even be civilly sued for doing such a thing. But if you have a reason, an articulable reason, an officer has a reason to remove you from their car, it's usually, in my personal experience, for safety reasons, because I have reasonable suspicion that there's a weapon in there, or sometimes in the past, if I've had reasonable suspicion that there are narcotics in the car, it's been shown that if you separate a suspect from the vehicle, there will be subtle nonverbal cues that will afford you opportunities to see other building blocks of reasonable suspicion.
Okay, so it sounds like that it gives you the upper hand of further investigation in order to see whether or not there's a reason to do so and find whatever it may be in their vehicle. So, I mean, whether you agree or not, I don't personally agree with that type of way of investigating. Unless you're obviously like you have to be clearly doing something wrong, in my opinion. But that's what we're dealing with. Don't do something stupid that's going to put you in that position. How about that? That seems like a reasonable request. Now, I'm sure you've seen those videos of like First Amendment audits and Second Amendment audits and Fourth Amendment audits and things like that. Just give me a really quick synopsis on what you think about those, because from my perspective, even though they are being absolutely the worst people sometimes, the people that are doing the recording, it seems as if they're doing what is actually legal. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you're going to have to explain further that, but I'm not familiar.
Okay, well, there's a bunch of kind of freedom fighters, if you will, on YouTube, where essentially they go around doing things that people would deem that officers would deem suspicious but not illegal. And they will put themselves in situations to see how police officers react. For instance, they'll show up to the public sidewalk of a police station and start filming and see whatever happens with an interaction with the police officer. Like, they will come there and tell you, you need to shut off that camera. And they, already armed with the law, will assert, no, I do not. I have a First Amendment right. I am part of the press, according to the First Amendment. I have every right to film. I have every right to take photographs. You cannot stop me because this block of sidewalk is publicly owned. And then, of course, they end up showing that the officers are really just like, I don't like you here. And they try to twist and turn the law in order to just have the officer more comfortable with the scenario, even though what the citizen is doing is fully legal.
Very interesting.
You don't have to answer that.
I'll send you.
I could just say that, again, that's just very strange to me. Everyone that I work with knows if we were in that situation, none of us would say that person couldn't do what they were doing, nor would we try to stop them. I'll just leave it at that.
Amen. Okay, now, what are things that normal citizens can do with police officers to kind of get to know their local precinct? And I know this is going to maybe differ between each, but what's a good stepping stone for communities to get involved with who their police officers are, so that there's not such a divide on who is policing in that town or city?
Well, a lot of businesses locally will host lunches or just any sort of meals and notify the department, hey, it's going to be happening on this date at this time. And the department will send out an email to all of us letting know that that's happening. And generally, many of us will go and we'll speak to whoever's hosting and we'll engage with the people there. I would certainly encourage that. If you're a business owner or even local churches, inviting officers in to have meals with them and hopefully have some good conversations.
Do you think that there's a place for an open forum to kind of ask local departments of the cities that are involved with these individual people, kind of along the way of getting to know the officers, of having a forum for people to actually understand what the law is, what police are allowed to do, and what rights individuals are able to assert? Because I think one of the issues is people don't understand the law. Whether you agree with certain things or not, at least understanding it will allow you to do a couple of things. One, assert your rights in situations when dealing with police officers. And two, if you are so adamant about something being wrong in your city amongst your constituents, then maybe you can actually help change local laws and local legislation by getting involved with the process of doing so. And especially as a Christian, fighting for what is righteous is a good thing. I mean, we see this throughout history with men of old who fought for maybe abolition of slavery, like William Wilberforce. 30 years after he died, after all of his talks with Parliament, they absolutely ended up abolishing slavery about 30 years past his death. And it was because he was so involved with the process of making law happen and engaging the community that needs to kind of hear this. So are those options for citizens to engage in, where the police come in and share that, or is that kind of we don't want you to know our secret sauce?
I don't think that I don't think that particularly about the city I work for would try to like we have some sort of thing that we're trying to conceal, that we would prevent that from happening, that sort of engagement or dialogue with the community. I've never seen something that organized take place. I'd certainly love to. I do know that my department in particular um, tries to be pretty active on social media uh, to share information, to share even things about our department that are positive in reference to a lot of the issues that we've been talking about, actually. We'll even share our opinions about things we disagree with or agree with, doing things the right way, and really trying to humanize us also. But as far as an organized event like that, I think that it could happen. If it doesn't, I don't think it'll be for the reasons that you mentioned.
Okay. Well, amen. I really appreciate this, Officer X. I do think that this is helpful. And like I said earlier, to those of you who are listening, I do not believe that the police are after you. I think the police suffer from a lot of sin like anyone else. And because they have a particular level of authority, it certainly will feel emotionally like it's sometimes even choking you with everything that we see on here, especially the way that the media portrays it. But I think that the overall experience is just going to be based because of sin, not because of specifically racism. It can be, but there's just not a way to actually know unless you see inside of the man's heart. Last question. What do you think would have happened if a civilian ended up tackling the officer for what happened to George Floyd in order to get off him?
Sadly, I think that whoever that person would be would receive similar type abuse. Maybe not in the same exact nature as George, but I imagine they would be apprehended and taken to jail for interference or something like that unjustly.
Even though in the law, it does allow for citizens to do that to police officers in some cases, right?
Absolutely, absolutely, it does. But it would be completely about the interpretation of what that would look like to the officers that are present, and they would believe that they were justified, and that's why they would probably react in that manner, and it would be wrong.
Well, there we have it, folks. Right from the mouth of an officer. It is legal to do that even against an officer, but it's all based on interpretation. And unfortunately, the culture that we live in, we have that particular type of a scenario be benefiting the police officer rather than the citizen. So, guys, this is a hard issue. This is a hard topic, and we're not going to see an answer overnight. We're definitely not going to see an answer this side of the glory of the Lord. So, I just wish and I hope and pray that this is something that was helpful, just to hear a different perspective and to hear an officer who is a servant of the Lord bear his heart and even be able to recognize that there are certain things that he just cannot stand and things that he's working through. So I do hope that this came off with as much grace, not only to those who disagree with me as far as the whole Black Lives Matter movement goes, but as well as you, Officer X. You are a brother. I do pray for you, and I really do appreciate having this conversation with you.
Yeah, brother, thanks for having me. And if you would allow me to say just one more thing, in case any listeners maybe got a certain idea, because I got to respond to you about systemic oppression, systemic racism, and I just wanted to make sure people didn't feel like I came off calloused or cold toward real grievances, real suffering. I believe oppression does exist in certain situations, and I'm not dismissing it when it is true and when it does exist. I want to stand with those against that injustice when it does happen.
Well, that concludes the interview. Thank you so much for watching. If you thought this was helpful at all, I would really appreciate your comments below, that you would share this video with your friends and timeline. I just hope that this illuminates a little bit of what a Christian police officer experience inside of a police department that is in fact mixed, that is in fact dealing with difficult neighborhoods that are patrolled, and hopefully that you get to see another perspective. If you thought this was helpful, go ahead and comment below on this video. Additional questions are welcome, and maybe this is something that we can do again. Also, remember that ultimately, as Christians, if you are not a Christian, and if you are a person who is involved with some of these movements, remember that only true justice comes from God. And of course, as Christians, we ought to be standing up for what is righteous and just. But of course, we will all one day have to deal with our personal sin with a personal Savior. Jesus Christ came into this world 2,000 plus years ago to save sinners. He died on a cross. He rose 3 days later. And because of that, he was able to defeat death, defeat sin, defeat unrighteousness and injustice. And because of that, we can be justified in the sight of God if we just repent, turn away from our sin, and put our trust and faith in Jesus Christ. This side of the cross, we will not see perfection. We will always experience sin and injustice and discord in this world. But apart from God and his holy law, there will be no justice. I thank you for watching. God bless you, and may the Lord keep you.